Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. My name is Bharath Reddy, and I have with me my colleagues Rijesh Panicker and Ashwin Prasad. So what we're going to be talking about today is the repealing of the AI diffusion framework. So the Biden administration had introduced what was called the AI diffusion framework with the idea of maintaining US dominance in AI. Now, under the Trump administration, the Bureau of Industry and Security has repealed this framework shortly before it was supposed to come into force on the 15th of May. So what was this framework? Why was it repealed? Was it a good idea? What are different countries? How are they going to be impacted by this? These are some of the things that we'll be talking about today. So to start off with, I'll maybe invite Ashwin over to talk about what the diffusion framework was and, why was it introduced in the first place? So any...
The diffusion framework is an evolution of all the chip export controls US has been imposing on the world since the mid 2010s. And as the AI application and AI use cases of semiconductors were on the rise, the export controls also eventually aligned themselves to be focused on AI use cases. And so therefore the AI diffusion framework is just an effort by the US to control where AI chips and AI hardware goes, and therefore control how AI is being used in the rest of the world. So they just didn't want their adversaries like China or Russia to get their hands on advanced AI chips, which can run advanced AI models, and the origin of which is ultimately in some part either in the United States or its allies or the partner countries. So they just didn't want the adversaries to gain advantage of the technology in which they have a dominance in. And so the AI diffusion framework was a manifestation of that. And it was also a balance of priorities, because while they were thinking about this through the security lens, they also had to think through the economy lens for the sake of the private companies that are involved in the manufacturing and design of these chips. And so it's a negotiation between the state and the private sector. And so therefore you see the diffusion framework having a restrictive stance against a tier of countries like China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and so forth. And you have another tier of countries which seeks to serve as a customer base or a way for the private companies in the American ecosystem to continue having customers and to sell to and to preserve their business in a sense. And ultimately, you have a very close tier of countries which are either very closely allied historically with the United States, like the Canadians or the British, and then you also have some countries which are so strongly placed in the AI value chain that they simply can't be replaced, like Taiwan or Netherlands, without whom even the US can't make chips. So you have this kind of a balance between, say, national security priorities and economic priorities of the United States playing out with the diffusion framework, and which just basically divides the world into three tiers, and each of these tiers are vetted out with a different treatment in their access to AI chips and hardware.
So the idea behind this is seems to be that you need to contain your rivals before they can build the most powerful AI models, or it's a way to gain an advantage over your rivals. And the US is able to do this because the semiconductor supply chain is very concentrated, like you said, in a few countries, and there are bottlenecks that can be leveraged to restrict the flow of chips. And compute usage is also indicative of performance of the AI models, whether in training the AI models or in inference time. The amount of compute that is being used is indicative of the performance of these models. So there have been some challenges to the scaling laws with DeepSeek using far less compute than other comparable models, but we'll maybe get to that later. But generally, we've seen a trend that compute usage in frontier AI models has been exponentially increasing, and this is an effort to restrict that key input to building AI systems. Now, Rijesh, what do you think is this strategy of restricting a rival, is that a good idea? Is something like introducing export controls, whether in the form of a diffusion framework or other ways of restricting access to chips, is that a good strategy at all in this AI race?
I think it depends on how you see the AI race playing out. There is a sect of AI experts who strongly believe that, say, the current LLM pathway is the path to ASI or AGI, like general intelligence or super intelligence, right? Now, if you subscribe to that this is the right path, and just then you're also saying that just scaling and more compute is enough, right? And then alongside that, there is the additional belief that whoever gets to AGI first has a unsurmountable advantage, because you get to AGI, ASI, then there is an intelligence explosion, and it's impossible for others to catch up once your AI has started. Now, if you subscribe to that theory, then yes, it makes sense to try and stop using diffusion frameworks, using chip export controls, because that's a short term game. You're saying I only need the export controls till I get to AGI. But then there is the opposing view that it's not necessarily the case that LLMs will lead to AGI, ASI, right? And we've already seen that the newer models sort of seem to be stabilizing around a certain level of functionality. They are quite useful. They're extremely useful, but they're not exactly. There's no step change in their intelligence, for lack of a better term, with each version. Like if you look at GPT, GPT-2, GPT-3, there were massive jumps in capabilities. If you look at GPT-4, 4.40, so on and so forth, they're improving, but it's not quite at the same pace, right? So if you think about it from that perspective, and also assume that there are other ways to achieve, or there might be other idea breakthroughs or code breakthroughs that can get you there, then you would have to say that how long are you going to do these export controls, and how long are you going to run the diffusion frameworks, right? Because the costs are high, as Ashwin was also saying. Like in this kind of a framework, it's extremely burdensome to everyone, including your friends, to keep up, to private companies, even to their own regulators, to manage and maintain all of these filings and everything that's required to keep track of these export controls is massive. And for the person on the other side who's trying to break it, they only need to break it once, basically. It's not like I need Nvidia chips every time, right? If I can start getting the latest Nvidia chips, and I can then also try to reverse engineer it and figure out what's going on and try to catch up. So yeah, so I mean, depends on where you stand. I personally think that the LLM approach need not necessarily lead to AGI. So therefore, I think that trying to do this kind of very narrow, very tightly coupled export controls focused only on hardware, it doesn't really solve the problem. For some time you may have some advantages, but essentially you're creating very strong incentives for China in this case, which is the primary competitor, to come up with their own chips. And they've already started doing that. Their Ascent chips are maybe 1/10 of where Blackwell is, but that essentially means they need to produce 10 times the number of chips. That's it, right? So it's not really that much of an unsurmountable problem. So I think it depends on where you stand. I think it's a bad idea, because I don't think that LLMs alone are going to lead to AGI. Yeah.
Right, but there seems to be a growing policy alignment towards this idea that super intelligence or AGI is going to be achieved in the near future, and scaling will get you there, and AI chips are, right? So you see some kind of a policy
Correct.
push towards that
Yeah,
objective.
and I think we spoke about this in our last podcast. I think the three of us, right, when we were discussing the super intelligence paper, where we were arguing that because you can't assign a zero probability to that idea, you have to act as if it might happen. So
Right.
that's true. But yeah, like again, in that paper, again, if you think about it, they were not just only focused on China, right? They were also worried about proliferation and all of that. So yeah, if all of those things come into play, then sure, maybe some kind of export controls. But again, as we've debated several times in the past, it's not clear to me how you stop the spread of ideas. You might be able to stop the spread of hardware chips for a little while, but how do you spread the stop of ideas, right?
So now that we've looked at what the framework was and what they're trying to achieve, why was it repealed? So the two reasons that were stated when they announced this was that one is that it'll be unenforceable because of all the regulatory compliance requirements. It's just too much of a burden on both the regulator as well as the companies that are selling the chips or exporting it and that entire value chain. The second is that it it makes diplomatic relations between the US and other countries. It makes those more challenging to maintain because the US is now seen as not partnering with other countries but expecting other countries to follow it and to be complying with the terms that the US is setting. So Ashwin, can you talk about a little bit more about these concerns itself and why they're a bad idea? And does it mean that the diffusion framework itself was a bad idea, or export controls also have the same kind of concerns as well?
I think the reasons that the American administration has stated are true, but we can read a little bit more between the lines. Their concern of a diplomatic fallout is genuine because, in effect, these export controls actually existed before the framework in different forms, but they were more ad hoc. The Bureau of Industry Security would take these calls based on each case, and it would happen on a case by case basis. And there was room for negotiation. There was room for bilateral deals to be struck, and for these deals to either fall through or happen on the same reasons as they did under the framework. But the framework kind of codified that. But still, when you are, as a country, imposing this kind of a policy instrument on the rest of the world and expecting them to fall in line, you're creating an effect in the minds of your friends and enemies about a way that you perceive them and the way that they perceive you. And I think this created a lot of concern because it was a very big precedent to set, right? That America will use its dominance in any supply chain to try and control how some technology works, and that inherently creates insecurities in the minds of states. And even the closest American allies will start to hedge against this. They'll start to plan and do things to avoid the US doing this in other technological verticals, or even to mitigate the impact that this can have in their own AI ecosystems. And so, obviously, the diplomatic fallout would have been felt, at least in the meetings that the Trump administration would have had with countries from January to May. And I'm sure this was a conversation that came up often, and they have sensed that, they have taken that pulse. And so that is the foreign policy angle. And then the innovation angle, they just claim that this will hurt American innovation. But what they have probably been more concerned about is the market that they're losing access to, and whether that market will then be fulfilled by Chinese chips and the Chinese AI ecosystem. And by essentially not allowing the American companies to even compete in some of these markets, they will have they are denying a huge economic opportunity to their own companies, and I'm sure that was something that was expressed by the companies also. And also the effect that it will have on the world, about how they will start to break away from American made chips and models, and the soft EDA tools and software and all of that, and finally just move over to the Chinese tools. And so that, I think these are the overall concerns. And I think this kind of a thinking has always existed in other technological forms, right? Like, we've always had ITAR, and it has always imposed certain restrictions on all countries along the same vein as the AI diffusion framework. But the only difference is that these technologies were sometimes dual use, but mainly strategic in nature. They were military focused or space focused or missile technology focused, something like that. And but for you to do that with a very, very civilian driven technology, with supply chains that are spread across the globe. They're not just in the US. It's spread across the globe. The US depends on some other countries as much as those countries depends on the US. To do that in such an ecosystem, I think raised a lot of concerns from all the stakeholders, and the Trump administration has made it a point to review every single policy that the Biden administration had as soon as it took office. They have reviewed a bunch of AI policies also, including how it is used for national security and how it's integrated in those processes. And I think this was AI diffusion framework was obviously the big one. They've had conversations, and this debate has raged on, and finally they've decided that this framework kind of an approach is not the best way to do it, and they might go ahead and replace it with something else, or they might just leave it just so that there is more negotiation and they have more control on a case by case basis. But yeah, I guess we can only speculate at this point.
It's interesting what you pointed out about this dual use technology, and there have been other examples of such restrictions on other technologies, right? And the maybe the reason why we are seeing so much interest around this is because this has a lot of civilian applications and it's being driven by civilian use cases, and the policy instruments that are being used to contain it are more driven by a national security or those kind of concerns. So it's seen as a threat, it's seen as something that has a lot of dual use applications, and the policy instruments are also aimed at clamping down or restricting your adversary from what could be possible using these technologies. And that's, I think, why you see this competition of this sort, or this race to get ahead and also to prevent your adversaries from making progress on these aspects. So when you're talking about this, I thought it'll be interesting maybe to look at the motivations of these different countries, what they're trying to achieve, and what will happen if they're subject to this environment, right? So like we've discussed, the US probably has the aim of having dominance in AI, and also having a thriving market and all of these other things that come with it. And there are two different camps in the US itself. So one is of this view that you need to contain your adversary, you need to have export controls, you need to control how the chips are being used, where they're being used, and all of that. And the other camp has companies like Nvidia, which are arguing for easier flow of the chips to the rest of the world, and that actually gives the US a lead, or more control over the AI, more power, or the ability to drive the AI development. So if you look at this from a Chinese perspective, what does China do when it's faced with such a situation? What does a country like India do? Is that what we're seeing right now? Rijesh?
Before we go to that question, right, I just want to say, to Ashwin's point around the reasons they gave for repealing the AI, I'm not entirely certain that the innovation concept, I mean, Nvidia claiming that it'll be a problem is a different thing. But in general, if you just look at AI development, it's mostly been the large, well-funded labs that have been doing and I really don't see how they would have stopped innovating no matter what the framework was, because they would have found their exemptions, or they would have been able to comply with it, right? So I actually think that the second reason, the diplomatic problem, was the predominant reason for not doing the diffusion thing. But back to your point around, how will China or India or any other country respond? See, for the Chinese, I think it's clear they've been at a war with, or they are getting into a very prolonged war with the US on multiple fronts. This is just another front in that sort of a battle. And I'm sure it's very obvious to them that while, whether it's called the diffusion framework or a chip control or a chip security act, which will probably come up now, right, as a replacement for this, it's very clear to the Chinese that it's all essentially aimed at them, right? So for them, the question is, okay, how do you subvert this, right? They will need their resilience. They're already on the path to trying and building their own chip design and manufacturing capabilities. They've made quite a bit of progress by the look of it, at least based on their reports. And I don't see China diverting from that, irrespective of what happens between China and the US now. Even if, let's say, tomorrow, Trump and Xi Jinping make a deal and the restrictions go down by a bit, trade restarts, I still don't think that China will say, okay, we don't have to develop our capabilities here. It's been part of their plans for a while now, and they are going to continue developing it. So I don't see how that changes. But I think, like we were talking a while back about the Malaysian company that's built, when the restrictions came out on chip exports, people noticed that Malaysia had suddenly had a huge jump in the number of orders for chips, and people speculated that it's actually shell companies that are just supplying the Chinese. And now we have reports that there's a Malaysian data center that's fully built around the Ascent chips, and presuming that the clients are actually Chinese. So China will find its ways to either, in the short run, they'll find ways to get access to chips and compute for their needs. But in the long run, I imagine China will try to say that, and not just China, a lot of other countries will also be concerned that, why should we get dependent entirely on the US for all of the infrastructure on the stack for this very foundational technology? For any other country, it makes a lot of sense to say, why not? There should be an Ascend AI chip that is at least as good as NVIDIA's AI chip, because it increases my options, right? It reduces the US's ability to pressure me in one direction. So China will try to push their own stack and ecosystem, and other countries will try and figure out if it makes sense for them to support it to some extent at least. India's position is a lot more interesting because China is our mortal enemy on the one hand, and the US is, well, we don't know if they are a friend or an enemy. Some days it seems like one, and some days it might seem like another. So from India's perspective, the question is the diffusion framework going away good or bad? And I think, probably a slightly different position from both of you. And I actually think that the diffusion framework was not bad for India at all, because it was very clear that we were tier two countries. We had a certain limit. I don't think India's current AI chip demand was so high that we would have gone above the cap, right? And even if we had, I'm fairly certain that we could have gotten exemptions, right? But now that the diffusion framework is gone, it's every person for themselves, right? Every country for themselves. It's Trump is very much interested in doing deals and winning those deals. We've already seen that that's what he wants to do, and he will very much use this as another tool, as another leverage point when he makes deals with India. And there's no guarantee that this particular deal will be better than what we would have got under the diffusion framework. So I'm not necessarily sure that the loss of the diffusion framework is good for India. Yeah, it feels nice that we are no longer a tier two country. We can say we are a special partner to the US, but that does not necessarily guarantee that the deal we'll now make with the US is going to be better than that deal. I hope it is, but that's not necessarily the case.
Right. Would there be any second order implications of the thing? Like you mentioned, India had a pathway to getting all the chips that it needed, and beyond that as well, those thresholds would have not been a limit, strictly speaking. But Ashwin, would there be any other fallout of for the industry of having such a framework with India in a tier two level, right? So would that have been a problem in any sense?
Yeah, I definitely see a negative impact, especially in the long term and the second order effects. But my position on this whole framework thing is that what happened now is a very good thing for India. That the framework was introduced and it raised all the red flags in India, because all the talk about US-India strategic relations, and for what it's worth, we were just placed in the tier 2 of this framework, and just it was a rude awakening, and something that we also needed, which was that only technological capabilities would be respected when it comes to with technological races and access to strategic technology. It's not going to be how friendly you are and all of that, and its common interests will vary. And so that was a reminder for India to at least have a baseline level of capability, either through technology or through foreign policy, in order to ensure some access, just so that the most strategic use cases of technology is preserved. And finally, it getting repealed is also a good thing, because, like you said, the first order effects were barely there. I mean, for instance, even the largest data centers in the country have most of their customers abroad. IOTA has a very small percentage of its reasonably small percentage of its business coming from Indian users itself. And the number of chips that we are talking about in India is very small. Even the India AI mission is talking about 10,000 GPUs. And the private data centers are also at around 18,000. But here, the diffusion framework's limits were a lot higher. It would have allowed us to have 100,000 chips last year. This year, it could have been 100,000 chips. Next year, it could have been even more. And we are not close to hitting those limits, at least in the next few years. But it would have had many other negative implications for the Indian AI ecosystem, but because the government and the industry's hope is that India, using its talent and using its experience working with American companies, then can benefit from positive offshoots coming out of this, like developing its own AI talent and using it for Indian AI ecosystem, or startups trying to operate at a cutting edge, or more investments into the technology sector because we have an expertise in AI. And all of these would have been impacted because an Indian machine learning engineer who's very accomplished will not have the most cutting edge work happen in India anymore, because the framework creates this environment where all the cutting edge AI development work will happen in the US or in the US allied countries. It will not happen in India. There were thresholds set for the number of chips or for the model weights, and above those weights you couldn't just even develop AI models in other countries, and that would have included India as well. And so we would have had even more talent go out from the country. I mean, right now we have a scenario where some of the companies have Indian GCCs, and these GCCs, they do the work which eventually feeds onto the American IP, but still there is a form of technology transfer happening. There is a transfer of skills, and a lot of the startups in Bangalore, for instance, actually used to work in some of these MNCs, and then they came out and started their own thing. And those kinds of things would have reduced in the long run, because if the framework had come into fruition, it would have been the norm. And then you would just also lose out on exports, right? There would be less incentive for any investor to investors and investors also to invest in the Indian ecosystem when most of the work is happening somewhere else. And so this whole creation of all of the work being concentrated in America and disincentivizing anything else happening elsewhere would have been bad news for India. And at least that is not the case anymore. But this is still a wake-up call for India, because this is the era of, we are already having conversations of geofencing of chips and location tracking and all that. So this is the environment we live in. This is how AI chips are being treated. They're being embargoed and they're being guardrailed and all that. So we have to think about our own pathway to the independent technological operation, which doesn't mean we can do everything ourselves. We simply can't. But it's also about where we allocate our resources. Is India AI mission buying so many chips from NVIDIA the best way to go about doing this? So those are the questions we need to think about harder.
I think both of you mentioned things that are replacing the diffusion framework, and maybe we'll get into that part. So some of the policy measures that were introduced while this was being rescinded was that, firstly, like Rijesh mentioned, there's a prohibition on the use of Chinese chips like Huawei's Ascend series of chips. So the idea behind that is that the Ascend series has some technology which was under export controls, the existing export controls, and that was used to build these SNCs of chips. And so they are seen as illegal or a violation of the export controls. And that's why these chips have been restricted from being used by US companies, or I think even allies, other countries have been restricted from using them. The second one is on restrictions on data centers providing use of their compute facilities for training Chinese models. So this is again a response to the instances of data centers cropping up in Southeast Asia, where they're trying to bypass the export controls by locating the data center somewhere else and then using the compute over there to train Chinese models or use it for compute in China. And along with these two things, there was also there's an extensive list of do's and don'ts and red flags that you need to be wary about. Who do you sell it to? What conditions do they need to meet? What is suspicious behavior when you're trying to when a exporter or manufacturer of chips is trying to sell it to a customer? What are the things that they need to watch out for? So those kind of due diligence actions have also been specified. And so all of these kind of strengthen the existing export controls against the tier 3 countries. So tier 3 countries were the list of countries that are the arms embargoed countries. So you're not so this includes China, Russia, Iran, and a bunch of other countries as well. So now these are all maybe ways of strengthening those export controls, but what you also see are something a little more disruptive in some sense, and which is what Ashwin, you mentioned about the Chip Securities Act and other measures for on-chip restrictions. So can you maybe tell us a little bit about what that means? And this has not been implemented, but it's something that is being considered. And what could be the longer term implications of something like this?
So basically, the U.S. government is trying to tighten its focus with the AI export controls by introducing other forms of control over where chips go and where they can be used. And location seems to be the lever that they are using. So unlike other exports, like like raw materials or something, where you can just you don't have any scope for modifying or changing the nature of the material. With semiconductors, since you're making them and since you're designing them and since you have that control, you can try and enforce certain inherent rules into the chip itself in a way so as to make it work in a certain way, and that includes location also. So you just include a GPS module or a location tracking mechanism inside the chip, and it can then have that built into its use case, and it's not going to be easy to bypass. And that's something that the US is trying to consider with this new Chip Security Act. Also, the Senate in the US equivalent of a parliament in the US has passed a law which is exploring these location-based controls as a way to control where chips go. And this was also one of the concerns and reasons for AI diffusion framework also, that why were some of the countries placed in tier 2 or some even in tier 3 like Macau? The reason was that they were being used to then funnel chips to another country, route chips to Russia or China, and that has been a case of concern for India also. That there has been reports of an Indian company then re-exporting chips that it bought from the US to Russia, and that was one of the speculated as one of the main reasons why we got placed in tier 2 and not in tier 1. So essentially, I see these location-based tactics as a way to circumvent the concern over these tier 2 countries. Instead of saying you're in tier 2 and dealing with that diplomatic fallout, what they're instead doing is they're trying to think of it through a location-based mechanism and trying to control it themselves through technology instead of a policy.
So while this sounds very great on paper, Rijesh, anything? What do you think will be the implications of having something so fundamental built into the chip itself? Will you be able to replace export controls by having these kind of mechanisms built into the chip, so you can control where they go, what they're used for, who's using them, and so on? And so maybe I'll add to what Ashwin said. So one was the geolocation module that would be built into this. The other one is the on-chip hardware restriction. So a chip right now, once you purchase it, you can use it for training whatever, and you own the chip, right? So there could be features implemented that you can use it for training these many GPU hours of compute, and after that the performance of that chip is limited, throttled to a certain lower capacity. So these kind of mechanisms also can be implemented. And are they foolproof, or is there any other consequences of something like this being built into the chip itself?
I assume that you're asking from the perspective of the country that's receiving those chips, right? Obviously.
Right. Yeah.
Because for the US, it's very clear why they want to do it. But so, yeah, I mean, yeah, it is a concern. Like, for example, just taking the geolocation thing, imagine that you have a data center built with these chips, and, the US at all times knows its location. At any point of time, they can shut you down, right? Worst case scenario, they can fire a missile at your data center because they know exactly where it is. Now, that even if you have a multiple distributed thing, they will know exactly where each chip is, so they can presumably take all of them out. So just basically from that perspective, it's not a good idea for people to have location of your chips in them. The compute thing, I'm not so clear that that can't be, like, if you say that the chip will run at full capacity for X and then it will drop down its performance. I'm sure somebody can come up with a scheme where my model trains at full capacity for X by zero point 0.8 of X, and then it goes down and then comes something. And there might be ways to bypass that. And see, all of these, I don't know if you can put a GPS chip on an AI chip, then is there a way to spoof your GPS location? I don't know, but I'm sure there are smart enough people in the world to figure out ways to do that also, right? So the point is, you do any of these things, you're just creating incentives that break them. And these become the kind of bottlenecks, this, like, it gives you a very high level of confidence that you are in control, but when it breaks, you'll never realize that you've completely lost control, right? Whereas the point of view of the other group that don't try all of this, just make sure that you're ahead in terms of research, and that is enough to maintain dominance. I kind of align myself more to that view because I kind of think that in that area, the US has significant advantages. They have maintained dominance over every other country for a very long period of time simply because they attract the best talent from across the world. Yeah, China is a large country. They may have a lot of talented researchers, but it still is only whatever 1.2, 1.3 billion, right? The rest of the 6.6 billion people are still interested in going and working in the US. That's still the place where the innovation happens. I think that's a more sustainable advantage. You can always stay ahead of the competitor. That's how I align. This seems very rigid. If it breaks very badly. And the incentives are massive for someone to break it, basically, right? So even for India will not be very happy if we have to buy, geo-tagged chips from the US, right? I mean, like the minister's already announced, right? We are trying to build our own indigenous GPUs by 2029, I think. And we will see more and more countries trying to do it. It makes perfect sense. I mean, this is a very foundational technology. Almost everybody agrees it will have massive use cases. There is no way any one country will be allowed to have such a huge hold on all aspects of the stack of that chip, even if it is the US. So,
To add to that, the whole topic of sovereignty is now raging up because of these kinds of issues, right?
exactly.
So for the US, when it is thinking about AI diffusion framework and AI chip export controls and Chip Security Act and all that, for them they're thinking about it through a national security lens. They're thinking what is a way we can mitigate some of the risks of some AI use cases by China, or this is the best way we can do it, and they're doing it. But from the perspective of other countries like India, like every other country that wants chips, they are thinking about it through a sovereignty angle. Oh, so they're thinking, or today they're restricting the number of chips we can buy. Then what do we do? Suppose we want an AI model that has to run on a larger number of chips. So does this mean that the US won't sell to us? So in that case, should we hedge against that? And then suddenly the sovereignty thinking is coming into the picture. Now, instead of the diffusion framework, if you have geofencing and control over how the chips are used in itself, then again it's an ownership issue, right? You're buying chips that you don't feel like you have the ownership over, and that elicits the same exact response as diffusion framework, because again you're thinking these are not my chips, so I don't have sovereignty. What do I do to gain sovereignty? And this thinking is going to be pervasive. It's going to happen not just in countries like India, but also the most allied countries like the ones in Europe, who are going to lose their minds over the privacy implications and the surveillance implications of these kind of chips are not clean anymore. I mean, we'd never heard chips being unclean, but suddenly you have those. We've only thought of chips being shady, for the lack of a better word, in the Chinese sense, that Chinese chips, you don't know what you're going to get. Chip backdoors and all of those were always been concerned with Chinese chips and Chinese telecom equipment. And now you're going to have a similar response to US chips, which is going to again have a lot of reactions behaviors being triggered across the world. And so I think geofencing or the diffusion framework will have the same effect. Yeah.
But practically speaking, I don't see a way, like, let's say the US goes ahead and does this kind of chip security by imposing geolocation and all that. Even if the Chinese were to come up with their alternatives, you can be almost certain that they'll also do something similar. So for any country other than the Chinese and the Americans, there's really no option. It's the devil and the deep blue sea. Basically, no matter which chip you pick, that it will be geotagged, and you just got to make your choice about which one you prefer, right? So
You're saying at least the US chips, these discussions are happening in the open, and
correct, yeah. And who knows, maybe again, see, at the end of the day, you might still end up in some kind of a tiered relationship, right? That where they, for their tier one partners, they won't, the geotagging is so vast that they don't actually know where your chip is. They just know it's in your country, for example.
right.
Something like that. So I don't know. Depends.
Right. So, yeah, very interesting times we're living in. And with all of these, you still, there's a lot of unexpected, unintended consequences of these actions, right? So you'll see that maybe cyber attacks against models, advanced models, will increase because if you don't have access to the chips, maybe the people will seek out ways to get those weights or access to those models through other means. Or you might see that chips are being smuggled so that they can access them in spite of these export controls. So you'll see all of these kind of things happening. And while all of these are going on, you also see that a massive data center a deal has been struck with Saudi Arabia and Qatar to build these huge data centers, which will be among the biggest in the world. So very sometimes counter and going against some of the policy instruments that are trying to control and restrict it. At the same time, then you see some other deals being struck which go against what that those instruments are trying to achieve. So very different kinds of scenarios that we are seeing play out, and it's definitely an interesting space to watch. And any closing comments from you guys?
No, I'm just curious to see what kind of a deal India strikes now that the diffusion framework is gone, right? We've seen Saudi Arabia and the UAE have struck fairly interesting deals with the US, and they're going to get a lot of chip supply. I'm curious to see what India does and what kind of a deal we come out of this with, right? Because to me, it seems like the US administration will use the supply of AI chips as a negotiating tool in their trade deals with us. It won't be something separate. I'm just interested to see how that will play out for us.
Ashwin?
Yeah, so the clear message from all of this is that we are now living in this phase of technology era where AI chip exports are going to be controlled and overseen and tightly, like the access is going to be tightly maneuvered according to strategic priorities. And this is a very interesting phenomenon to watch out for. It's going to evolve in interesting ways, I'm sure. And it's going to, I mean, I've even heard of reports that as soon as the BIS set some thresholds for chips to be above which the chips to be not sold to China, many companies came out with chips that were just below the thresholds to meet these requirements. And then BIS had to, arbitrarily say, no, we're not going to allow these chips also. These chips are also going to be blocked. And so this whole dealing with the technology, which is a spectrum, by imposing thresholds and caps and limits, is always
That's
going
a
to be
never-ending game because you never know how software innovations will happen, how technological or methodological innovations will happen in a space like AI in particular, right? Because it's math at the end of the day. Any new idea might change the way the whole thing is working.
Yeah.
So this kind of setting the threshold limit, it never work. It'll always, in the long run, I think that's always going to fail. So yeah, it will be quite interesting.
And I think the last thing I want to close with is that all of this, the Chip Security Act, AI Diffusion Framework, all of these just incentivizes an open source ecosystem for chip building, open source platforms for chip design. And maybe these will prove as a thrust to developing alternatives to Synopsys EDA and all the other platforms that right now have an effective monopoly on chip design and chip manufacturing.
Right. So lots to think about and lots to watch out for. So we hope you have enjoyed listening to this, and thanks to Rijesh and Ashwin for joining us, and see you all next time.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.